Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I see almost about 250 people who have joined this webinar, and I'm sure there are many more on the YouTube. Um, I, on behalf of the Revitalizing Rainfed Agriculture Network, which is a network which formed about 12 years back, and really looking at the issues of rain-fed agriculture across the middle part of the country, where largely you have the tribal systems there. And we've been working on that to look at policy initiatives. This pandemic has really affected this whole bandwidth of states where rain-fed, or not just states, but the geographic areas where rain-fed agriculture is there in terms of migration. Um, and therefore, as a network, we have been meetings in the last couple of weeks virtually. And we said we need to reimagine how this network would have to look at the future. Um, and in that, we thought who would be the best person to advise us and to give us his understanding. And there we invited, and we really are very grateful to you, Sainath, to come in on today and sort of talk to this network so that we can start thinking of reframing our next steps into the future. I mean, P. Sainath needs no introduction to anybody in this country who, who really is concerned about what's happening to rural India. He, from to me, I've known him for a couple of years and worked on some of the issues together. I mean, he's really put rural journalism on track. I mean, what it is meant to be, and removed that this thing starry-eyed urban journalism and brought a certain sense. A Magsaysay Award winner. Um, I mean, his reporting on farmer suicide, and of course, his book which won him, where there is on the whole drought thing. But I don't know how many of you know this. He is also the illustrious grandson of our late President V.V. Giri. And I picked the trade union part of that and ascribed the sense of urgency and the issues that he raises. So, Sainath, thank you. And I really ask you the very first question in that sense, where are we heading in terms of the rural distress that is happening, and especially in the rain-fed areas in terms of livelihood, in terms of farming practices, how do you see this pandemic impacting it, and seeing, therefore, what are the immediate steps that we need to be thinking of? Over to you, Sainath.
Thank you, Gagan. Where are we? We are between a rock and a hard place, and we're headed for the hard place. Livelihood, nutrition, and the macroeconomy, as you say, in rural areas during and post-COVID, in view of reverse migration. I want to come to that word, reverse migration. Yeah, what's happening on the livelihoods is pretty apparent. On March 26th, this country discovered the species or creature called labor migrant, who has been around for a very long time, 400 million plus migrants totally, and over 100 million crossing state borders in search of livelihood and employment. Now, it's important to know that it's not just the labor migrant. We are focused on that, and yeah, that's a very important section. Uh, we are focused on that because it affects the middle classes when we lose our services. But every other section of agrarian and larger rural society has also taken a beating and continues to take a terrible beating. Take crafts, handicrafts, handlooms, craftspersons. That sector is the second biggest employer in India after agriculture. They're just smashed. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of well-meaning development sector professionals did quite a bit for the crafts and handlooms people. Well, 95% of hand-woven fabric comes from this country, and brought them to urban markets. Now, the problem is that that has changed. In fact, they are far more dependent on those urban markets. And annually, those exhibitions which you have, I mean, from permanent or semi-permanent ones like Dilli Haat, but February, March, April are the peak months of the kind of exhibitions where they make a huge amount of their income for the year. This year, all the ones in March and April were cancelled. So you have God knows how many craftspeople sitting, one group sitting in the exhibition site areas with piles of unsold stock, and thousands of others sitting at home with piling, mountain piles of inventory, and many of them facing cancellation of orders from very, very big companies, corporations, etc. So weavers, potters, other craftspeople, dyers are all in extremely serious trouble. And it affects different professions. It affects everybody, but it affects different professions differently. Take the case of, say, coastal fishermen. Now, we've just, in the People's Archive of Rural India, recently carried a story from Andhra Pradesh and the Vishakhapatnam coast. Now, fishing is banned every year for 2 months. There is a breeding season ban on fishing. Quite correctly so, and the fishermen observe that ban. That ban annually is from April 15 to June 14. What it also implies is that the 2 weeks preceding the ban are the peak fishing season, and that's when fisher folk make most of their money in those 2 weeks. This year, both those weeks were subsumed in the lockdown. So they lost out on their peak earnings season, and there's a ban way into June 14 due to the breeding season. So you're going to have a lot of trouble. Second, there's also the politics and societal and propaganda stuff that goes on here that has an impact on the livelihoods of people. For instance, fishermen are telling us that on the East Coast, that people are telling them we shouldn't be eating these fish. They're coming from the East, they're coming from China, they're coming with the coronavirus. Now, hilarious as that may sound to you, so a substantial number of people buy into it. Okay, it's made the WhatsApp rounds, it's done that. So that's fishermen. Now you move to landlocked areas like Bundelkhand, you move to Chitrakoot, where boatmen who depend on that tourism season in summer and again in Diwali to make any money at all, they're finished. Not a boat can leave, not a boat can be on the water just now. Which is the profession you want to look at? You want to look at the forest produce gatherers. You want to look at the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, the Kamars, the huge numbers of them. They're finished. Access to forest is finished. Then the bamboos they bring to make their baskets with, there are tribes that subsist on that, that there is no sale for. So you're going to have you already have an extremely serious situation cutting across a swathe of occupations. In fact, it's interesting to start figuring out that people are learning about how many occupations there are and the diversity of occupations in the countryside. Now, what happens to nutrition? What happens to a number of other associated things? Think for a moment that all the schools and colleges closing, all the schools closing, what it does, the absence of the midday meal, which was the main meal of the child in a given day, that's gone. It's gone. A few people, a few places, in a few states, a few administrations are trying to put in some substitute. I don't know that it has, outside of a couple of places, that has been very successful anywhere. So what's happening to child nutrition is something terrible. Yeah. One of the things you want to imagine, one of the things I hope we can actually fight and achieve, because nothing is going to happen on the basis of our imagining something, however good it is, if we don't understand that this is also not just a medical or a health process, but a process of politics and politicization. Okay, so now you have uh, the nutrition of children. Who are the people on the front lines of the battle where nutrition of expectant mothers and children? Who are these people? And who are the people who feed those children when they are born and small? Two gigantic forces of involuntary volunteers. I mean, they're volunteers, but they are not allowed to be anything more than that. But they made volunteers so that we don't have to pay them a decent wage. ASHAs, Anganwadis. Okay, these are absolutely the front line. These are the frontline workers in whose hands, in some of whose hands, the future of your children depends. What you can do, absolutely, is to regularize both these groups, ASHA workers, Anganwadis. They have to become full-fledged public sector or government employees. Please know that in the 90s, up to the 90s, many of them sanitation workers also, primarily sanitation workers, first of all, were indeed corporation employees, government employees. With the new economic reforms of that time, we scrapped all these jobs, outsourced recruitment through some rapacious contractor, and rehired the same people at lower salaries with no benefits, no health benefits, no nothing, no bonuses, nothing. Well, in some cases there were, but not otherwise. So the whole, um, there are huge groups of people. You need a gigantic expansion of the public services with people like Anganwadis, sanitation workers, ASHA workers, absolutely taken on as full-time government employees on par with other government employees of that scale, and not given pathetic 3,500, 4,000 rupees a month, and the helper getting 1,500 rupees a month, and stupid incentives that they leaves them less in their hand than they had before undertaking the job. So we're talking about millions of people here when we talk about sanitation workers, ashas, and Anganwadis. If you can't, if you can't regularize them, if you can't give them a decent lifestyle, if you can't a decent livelihood, if you can't do that, you are going to slide further down the nutrition chain. The second thing is government in education. You know, Gagan, just think, huh? You and I are having this discussion on Zoom. Yeah. All the rich elite institutions, I should know because I've been speaking on several of those. We're doing our classrooms on Zoom. We're doing our lectures on Zoom. We're doing our webinars on Zoom. Please tell me, how many government schools and colleges have anything remotely approaching this facility? Please look at the fact that we may just have finished children's education at the primary and elementary and secondary levels. We don't know how long those schools are going to be closed. Yeah. And even if, say, we switch completely to zooming about, yeah, even if we switch completely to that, we are then completely removing the human element and the human interaction in teaching and education, which to my mind, old-fashioned as I may be, is a very fundamental element of learning. It's a completely, that personalization, that human interaction. Now just think again for a moment, how many government schools there are And how many of them have a blackboard is another question altogether. How many of them can tomorrow switch when you are amongst the lowest spenders on education in the world? Lowest. Hmm? You're amongst the lowest in that, and you are completely pathetic in terms of the infrastructure, the quality that you, how many teachers do you have? How many of your government school teachers have access to these technologies at their home, let alone at the school? If that is the case, and you arrive at an answer, think of the children and what they're going to do for education. And think of what kind of society we turn out when there is a complete, when the relationship between the teacher and the student is a virtual thing, not not real, not direct. I'm not saying you shouldn't have this, but you shouldn't not have that. And I think you're going to see a major switch in this, because many of the education sweatshops, those that have the capacity to put in these machines, to put in these platforms, they're going to do it, and they're going to go more and more for that. The nutrition also is linked to the question of health. And, you know, when we're talking about uh, what Ravindra and I were just talking about before we began here, a lot of the discussion is taking place, and a lot of people seem to be agreed that at the macro level, at facilities, at in agriculture and migrations, we need to be, we need a course correction. Uh, I differ with that. I don't think there's any correcting the course we were on. I think you need a change in course. I think you have to take a very different course from that which we followed for 28 years, accepting problems as solutions. One example, one small example. This pandemic, please ask yourself, which is doing the greater damage? The virus or our response to it? Which is hurting more people more badly? It's worth looking at. But here's the thing. For 40 years, we accepted, despite what is there about health and nutrition in our constitution, despite the directive principles of state policy, despite the understanding of health as a human right from the time of Alma Ata onwards, despite what the directive principles of state policy in the Indian constitution say, the majority of us came around to living with the idea, acceptance, if not, acceptance, if not understanding, that healthcare is something that can be bought and sold and traded on the stock exchanges. Okay? It never was, it can never be. Health is not a subject made for corporate efficiencies. Health is a highly personalized thing, different between every member of a family. Yeah, that's why you don't diagnose one person and treat everybody in the family, right? You don't. Health is a highly personalized, body to body, human to human subject. It is a human right. It is a human need. But we turned healthcare into an industry, into a highly profit-making industry, and we got the bulk of people we got the bulk of the middle classes anyway to accept that health insurance is equal to health. Health insurance is equal to the health of the insurance companies, not to public health. And you want to look at this attitude, where it's rooted and how deep it is. On March 20th this year, the Wall Street Journal, its editorial board, no less, wrote an editorial signed by the editorial board in which a line says, "No nation can forever protect public health at the expense of economic health." There you're making a clear distinction between the health of people and the health of an economy by which they understand Wall Street, right? I mean, this dehumanization that has occurred amongst us, it is a dehumanization. It's a loss of a moral compass, is a very mild way of putting it. We've accepted healthcare is this. We've accepted what the World Bank pushed on us, the idea that education has to expand massively in the private sector. They make certain ritual noises about improving it in government schools. Your education, your health are very closely tied to nutrition and nutrition status and the affordability of anything for for the millions and millions of Indian children who are already going very hungry. The third thing we need to know, and okay, we'll come back to the third thing a bit later. Let me talk about the part of your question that asks me about um, keeping in view reverse migration. I will appeal to every one of you. This reverse migration and why did they leave and will they come back? All very important questions. There's a much more important one that we have to understand, settle in our heads before we talk about reverse migration. Why did people migrate in the first place? Why did people leave their homes, their loved ones, their children, their parents, their land perhaps, their herds? Why did they leave all this and migrate in the first place to come to the city to work as your domestic servant or mine? We need to answer that question if we're going to answer anything about the post-COVID situation. Will they come back? I think that if they come back, and I believe that many of them will, because I think a certain number of them undoubtedly will, because they don't have a choice, they don't have an option, they need the work. As I said, you'd understand that if we understood why they came here in the first place. Why did they come here in the first place? For decades, under neoliberalism, we trashed agriculture. We trashed the millions of livelihoods attached to agriculture, the what we call the broader agrarian sector, the livelihoods affiliated with or dependent on agriculture, even if they were not cultivators. We trashed millions of livelihoods in the countryside, and now we're asking them, or some of them are trying to go back to what doesn't exist. Okay, so yes, I see that. I see a significant number of them already. Now there has been some slowdown as people are realizing that there may not be anything to go back to. None of this was necessary. The contemporary, none of it was necessary.
Sainath, can I intervene here? Because I think you're talking of a very important point.
Yeah.
As RRAN, this becomes somewhat our business in terms of, therefore, if this somewhere people have learned this lesson, what are the kind of policies we should be able to push for at the state level, where some of us are fairly active? I don't know at the national level whether everybody will listen to us. But still, what would be the frame areas of policy that we should be talking of in terms of the agriculture sector in the rain-fed area, but also largely in the frame?
Yeah, Gagan, please feel free. I mean, all the others also in the panel, feel free to interrupt when you want to take it to a specific direction. First and foremost, I've been begging since March 26th, and since March 25th, 26th, it was a public appeal. Rain-fed, no rain-fed, whoever you are as an agriculturist or a farmer, please, please, please go entirely food crop in the Kharif season. I cannot tell you how important that is. Just look at the crop from the Rabi season. Okay, that will be the first major policy shift. Look at the crop from the Rabi season. There are, even in the Rabi, there are significant sections of cash crop. There are significant sections of cash crop, and look at what's happening to them. Look at the fact that you have some, I don't know, 170 lakh hectares or something like that under cotton. Where are you going to sell your cotton? You've got God knows how many lakh hectares under sugarcane. Where are you going to sell your sugarcane? In areas of your where your network is active, like Nalagonda in Telangana, the watermelon farmers are watching their watermelons go bad. Every single paisa they invested is going down the drain. Now, you're not going to be able to sell the existing cash crop. Second, by the time the Kharif comes around, please note this. This is important for your, whether it's for rainfed agriculture or for all agriculture. You're going to see, you're already seeing a gigantic collapse in purchasing power and in consumption. In the advanced industrial countries, they're talking about falls of 20 to 30% in income. You're seeing the United States with 30 million people filing unemployment claims. Gagan, if the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy is anywhere near reality, and I'm very frightened that they are, then 120 million people have lost their jobs in 1 month in India. That's 120 million, 12 crores of people. What kind of pressures are these going to create on agriculture as people return there, or some of them, even when large numbers of them return there? Yeah, what kind of situations is it going to create? So you've got to think in terms of that. Number one, more than 70% of your small and marginal farmers are also net purchasers of food grain on the markets. They don't produce enough food for their own families' survival. And as we've moved more and more into cash crop, that danger and insecurity and fragility grows. I have begged people in Marathwada and Vidarbha who have significant sized holdings on average, 7 acres in Vidarbha, 5 acres in Marathwada. Can you keep 1 acre, half an acre, where you grow only food for the security of your own family? This has been a debate and a plea going on 25 years. But the compulsions for them, their debt, their need to educate their children, the expenditures they have, the blowout costs of cultivation in the old technologies of conventional technologies of agriculture, these have meant that they have dedicated every single square inch to the cash crop they're growing. Now, if again in Kharif you grow cash crop, you're going to drown in it. The income isn't there, the consumption isn't there. A lot of people are not going to touch your cash crops, and you're not going to be able to feed your family. So the first thing, please shift to food crop in Kharif. Second, what your network has looked at, in various ways, all are critical areas, okay? But I'm saying it's not, I don't want that we take agriculture as some sort of a laboratory area and where we can observe something under a petri dish, or in a petri dish or under a microscope. I think that your network has got it right, that the complexities of many sectors, like say the work and the exploration that you've done of seeds, and I'm in total agreement with the idea generally, which I believe you share, that don't even think about agriculture if you're not going to think about it in agroecological terms. If you're not going to do that, don't think about it, because you're going to do damage by making plans that are going to devastate people further. Whether it's the question of seeds, what kind of seeds, what to grow, where to grow. If I say, let's grow pepper in Alaska and coffee in Norway, you laugh. But the fact is that we grow sugarcane in Marathwada, in a perennially drought-prone area, which was not always so bad off when 100 years ago, it was a major, when you had major millet cultivation. Anantapur, I don't know if my friend Bablu is on this meeting or in this webinar. I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from my great friend, one of my oldest friends there, Mallareddy, about what happened with climate change, how it came about, what happened with the disappearance of millets, the coming of groundnut, and how clearly it did to us what it did to the Sahel in Africa. It did that in Anantapur. And in the middle of the southern Indian peninsula, you're having areas of desertification, like Dargah Honnur in Anantapur, where now Bollywood films are shot instead of going all the way to Rajasthan, or the South Indian films are shot. So yes, we're going to have to factor in climate change. We're going to have to factor in the technologies we use, what kind of irrigation or water use or moisture use that we have, what kind of crops we are going to grow, who controls the seeds, who controls the decision makings. But we can't do this. We can't do this, Rabindra, Gagan. We can't do this in the abstract, away from the political process of corporatization of agriculture. So answering one of those questions I see on that list, I think you're now at an incredibly complicated situation. The march was towards corporate agriculture. Now you've got millions of people going back to their villages possibly. Will that march to corporate agriculture stop? No, it won't. Not if we don't understand it as a political phenomenon and we don't resist it politically, organize people for it. If we don't do that, the march towards corporate agriculture will continue. So you've got all these problems, but I want to make one point about the migration. I'm saying that there's no course correction. There is a change in course. What is the model of development? What are the myths that single great myth that it's based on? Industrial capitalism's development model is that, and then we'll move to whichever question you want, is that you go back to the Industrial Revolution in England. They say what is inevitable, what is absolutely inevitable, is that agriculture will yield to industry. Agriculture cannot absorb so many people. Remember, Andhra Pradesh and Mr. Chandrababu Naidu and McKinsey's Vision 2000 or Vision 2020, sorry, Vision 2020, and we are in 2020. McKinsey, or as I call them, McKiss of death. Any government, any report they write for that a government adopts, that government dies. Mr. Naidu's Vision 2020 says in the first page or two, we need to get 40% of the population of agriculture. At the root of this is the belief that country is developed as agriculture took a backseat and industry, the smokestack factories, all these expanded massively. That is never going to happen again. Huge changes in automation, huge changes in IT, huge changes in technology, and the coming of artificial intelligence is going to mean there are fewer and fewer and fewer jobs in those sectors. In 2018, the IT industry, 17-18, which had brought automation to all the other industries, automation came home to roost. Yeah, and by 2018, the top 7 IT companies in India laid off 56,000 people, middle senior, people who'd worked for them 15 years, 10 years, 20 years. Okay? You're not going to have an expansion of jobs there. But all this is based on the idea that people in any developing economy move from agriculture to industry. And it's based on the idea that in England after the Industrial Revolution, wages went up as England became a capitalist country. That is not what happened. Workers, agriculturists, people displaced from agriculture in colonial England, had the option of migration to 104 enslaved colonies. You do not have that option. Because people could go off to the temperate colonies, Prabhat Patnaik has explained this brilliantly, beautifully. You've had 50 million Europeans migrate to the so-called New World, Australia and America, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other countries, 50 million. Britain, in 1820, Britain had a population of 12 million. By 1915, 16 million Britons had migrated to the New World and other countries, including India. You do not have those options. Because so many people migrated, the worker had options, and the capitalist in England had no option but to allow a rise in wages. In addition to which, England grew richer and richer from the plunder of those 104 colonies, primarily India. So this was actually what happened. Not that capitalism made people's lives better immediately on the collapse of feudalism. Everywhere we have followed this faithfully, the theology of capitalist development, that you have to downgrade agriculture, take people off agriculture, not understanding how much remains to be done in Indian agriculture to make it stable, that it's not just about output and seeds, it's about livelihoods. So I'm saying this central myth, this calls for a course, not for a course correction, but an entire change in course. When you think in those terms, then you're going to have to think in different terms of different forms of ownership, not the current forms of ownership in agriculture that still exist. You're going to have to go back to very old ideas of land redistribution, of land reform in a number of ways, and experiment with different kinds of ownership. And we have some fantastic examples of landless people doing incredible things with collective ownership of their collective projects, like the Kudumbashri and the Krishi Sanghas of Kerala. So I'm saying that we need to be looking at it like a different universe, not as correcting policy A and policy B.
But therefore, thank you, Sainath. But therefore, what you're saying is far more decentralized approach to public policy would be the order of the day, and you can't have 10 people sitting in Delhi who know everything, deciding the larger public policy. And also, you're saying public investment in agriculture across the board has to be rethought, and that we need to look at our traditional agriculture in that sense. But I want to ask you a secondary question, and I think that's also an area where your heart is. Does this new scenario offer us in any way to handle the issue of inequality? Or are we going to see a further sort of jump in the inequality space, which already is horrible in its in numbers?
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. It offers you opportunities to come out openly, speak more explicitly, and have more people listen in the present situation if we speak properly. And two, yes, it's going to further take up inequality. But I have one little caveat, Gagan, about the decentralization.
Hmm?
We have had decentralization, a very fake decentralization for over 25 years.
Sure.
Decentralization in the Indian context has been, and you're seeing it in the handling of the pandemic, okay? You leave the baby, you leave the problems with the states and centralize the solution power. Yeah. Why on earth did you start a PM Cares Fund,
Correct.
drawing away resources from the states which desperately need money to fight problems in which you are giving them no assistance as the center, number one. Number two, the what corporations give to the center will be counted as CSR, right? Huh? But that is a right that the states have to fight for to be able to get it. Number three, just consider this. When I say fake decentralization, you will find that I was writing about this in 98, 99, after looking at the Panchayati Raj process. I think I was a huge supporter, and I'm a huge supporter of local self-government. But what we did in In content, what we did in content was to decentralize the problem and centralize the power of solutions. So, okay, we did quota-based reservations, which I remain the biggest supporter of. Yeah, and thousands, lakhs of women never seen power in their lives. For the first time, had their hands on the lever of the power. But at the precise moment that the lever was less and less meaningless. Yeah. So we created all sorts of Panchayati Raj. But when Panchayati Raj met corporate power, when Panchayati Raj ran into globalization, the latter won. It didn't matter what the Gram Sabhas said about land acquisition. Corporations got the land they wanted. The development that what the panchayats may have wanted, that was never honored except in breach. So this idea of decentralization, we are doing that now with the health system. We are doing that with all the problems that are coming up. Mr. Modi tells the nation that the states, the real task and challenges before the states. And yet, in the center, you're making microscopic laws about which kind of vehicle is allowed which during which hours in a red zone in a state 2,000 kilometers away from you. Okay, you're actually making those laws in the center and asking the states to take the burden. So I'm saying what we call decentralization has to be something very different from the fake decentralization that we have introduced. As a matter of fact, we have more and more centralized, especially with actions like GST. Yeah, all the one major source of revenue that the states had, that's gone. It's now in central hands. We set federalism back by 50 years with the GST by taking away that financial power from the states. And many of the states, sort of lined up for the slaughter. Yeah, that's one problem. Now, inequality. Oh, I just love it. I'm watching so many people who in January, you know, were poo-pooing inequality, calling it a debilitating debate. Please just go up and Google under the names of some of your most famous editors, Gagan. Guys who in January were telling us, there was actually a sustained attack on Oxfam's inequality report, which, by the way, I think was an extraordinarily important report. Yeah, there was this huge attack. In fact, some of the newspapers carried pieces, some of the publications online carried pieces headlined as that this sort of report was dangerous for the poor. You see, because all of us are looking after the poor. And here are these jokers speaking about inequality. Inequality is the fastest growing sector of India, not IT, inequality. In year 1991, when you began your so-called reforms, India did not have a single dollar billionaire. In year 2000, according to Forbes, we had 8. In year 2012, we had 53, which was the same year your socio-economic caste census started. In year 2018, we had $121 billionaires in this country. $121 billionaires whose net asset worth, cumulative net asset worth, was equivalent of 22% of your gross domestic product, giving an entirely different meaning to the word gross. Yeah? 121 individuals in a population of 130 crores, yeah, held wealth equivalent to 22% of your GDP. And here you have these stalwarts and these great economists. I think this is the time when you call all these great economists to account. But when you have a media and a bunch of thoroughly either people in agreement with with those ideological flavors, or having not the intellectual apparatus and equipment to challenge and say, today you're telling us we have to do something for the poor. Hey guys, wasn't it you for the last 20 years telling us otherwise, that inequality doesn't matter? Inequality breeds competitiveness. In 2017, your chief economic advisor, Arvind Subramaniam, and Mr. Vivek Debroy, one of the great lights of the Niti Aayog at that time, said on a public television discussion with Thomas Piketty, inequality is not a big issue. It's not an issue. Okay? One said it's not an issue, dismissed it. The other said, I have to go with Vivek on this one. I have to agree with him on this one. Today, you're looking at the disasters because your pandemic is not doing an equal damage. It is not a great leveler, nothing of the sort. It's devastating people who did nothing to spread this pandemic. It's devastating people who have no means of protecting themselves. It's devastating people who have no access to public health, to healthcare. It's devastating people who cannot afford testing. And there are hospitals in Mumbai, five-star corporate hospitals, charging 6,500 rupees and more for testing. It's devastating people who do not have enough to eat. When people are half-starved, when they are completely without nutrition, the impact of any disease, coronavirus or other, is going to be greatly heightened. But it's in this period that we came to accept healthcare as something to be bought, sold, traded on the stock exchange. So, one lesson. Yes, I think the inequality has done us unbelievable damage. Second, again, we stand in every policy we have followed stands in violation of our constitution. Please read the directive principles of state policy, which begin with a preceding paragraph talking about the challenge being fighting, mitigating inequality, minimizing it. Okay, it says that. That's what your preamble says that. Justice and equality. Third, inequality has grown to such a phenomenal extent. You're all familiar with the Oxfam and the Human Development Index figures. I won't bore you with that. But will it increase or will it decrease? You're going to see a huge strengthening of power and concentration at the top. You saw this after 2008 because states today exist, nation states exist to work for corporations and corporate power and global corporate power. In 2008, a gang of corporations on Wall Street tanked the entire world economy. Okay. In the same year that, in fact, even the great American pro-corporate newspapers carried features like the guilty 50 of Wall Street, and showed that they came from the 4 top business schools of USA. All this they accept. But then when the bailout packages came, they went to the same corporations, they went to the same companies. They're going to the same companies which are going to lay off millions of workers. And in 2008, the year Wall Street brought the global economy down, CEOs in America took home $24 billion in bonuses. Okay, 2008, 2009. It led to after that, you saw food riots in many countries. You saw the Arab Spring that did not come because of Google and Twitter, but because the most basic bread in Egypt went up by 85% in price overnight. You had food riots in Yemen. All those 4 countries where the Arab Spring began saw a serious food crisis. Inequality. Now, if we are going back to the kind of health system we had before, what should we visualize instead? You need a gigantic health system, a national health system. You need to see that public health is in the hands of the public sector. You just look at the fact today that Mr. Boris Johnson's life, he says, was saved by a group of public health sector nurses in the NHS. The same Boris Johnson, the same British cabinet under Boris Johnson is reported to have, gleefully clapped when they turned down the pay rise sought by those nurses and cut that rise to one third of what had been recommended by the committees, by the committees that had studied the thing and made a particular recommendation. Those nurses were not given one third of the rise officially recommended for them by the committees that studied the subject. Do not put yourself at the mercy of private health sectors. This is India's problem for a very long time. You all know in the areas where you work, you know it and you know it's the fastest growing component of, or the second fastest growing component in some areas, the fastest growing component of rural family debt is health expenditures. It's inequality that brought us to the situation of health where a billion people are completely defenseless. You and I have the possibilities of doing something or being attended to if something goes wrong. A billion Indians do not have that possibility. If you look at the if you look at the NSS surveys, 42nd round, 50th round, 62nd round, 70th round, the so-called health rounds of the NHS, see how much the number of people who cannot afford, who didn't take medical treatment because they couldn't afford it, did not seek it. See how much that has doubled or trebled or whatever it has. It's gone up massively. And we keep changing the definition of medical coverage and treatment and showing that we are covering more people. So inequality, if you do not address inequality, we are doomed. But is it going away as a result of this? In Europe, there are a few countries which are going back to their welfarist origins, at least to some extent. We're not even talking about it. We are talking about further marketization. We're talking about further doing things on this line, right?
Okay.
So I think that inequality is going to deepen, it's going to grow. And the relief packages will be hogged and appropriated by the richest and the most powerful, unless we understand that our fight is also a political one and organize and demand accordingly.
Yeah.
Sainath, the central message I'm getting is no, rather than tinkering or adjusting policies, the whole systemic change and then the politics of it is a central battle that we need to address. Huh? One dilemma we constantly face is there is a crisis of incomes in the rural areas.
Yeah.
If I go to a farmer in a dryland area, he wants water or he wants a job or he wants to move out. How do align get people aligned to the whole politics of it? People don't want to stay. That's a big puzzle that we are facing in the when we work on this.
You know, if
Can I also just add to it,
Yeah.
and then maybe you can we
Yeah.
wind up. I think it's very important what Ravindra has said. But if I put what you're saying, Sainath, that one we are talking in your right in the beginning. You said invest in health infrastructure. You also said the jobs that get created would be that of ASHA workers and Anganwadi workers if you really sort of make them
Yes.
permanent and full time and this thing. Increase public expenditure in public health. You talked of increasing public expenditure in education at the ground level, which should also create jobs of another kind. And thirdly, and which includes technology. The third, which you're saying, increase public expenditure in agriculture. And if you could spell out 2, 3 areas where what kind of policies, very sharp policy imperatives we do in the last one of agriculture, which will lead to a great, so would it be increasing MSP, seeds, but what would be the 1, 2, 3, 4, which would make agriculture, public investment in agriculture, uh, making an impact?
First of all, get corporations out of agriculture.
Okay.
Get them out of agriculture. That is the zone on which the largest number of people are dependent, vulnerable, fragile. Number one. Number two, if in what are those major things, investments you can make? Gagan, what about public provisioning of inputs for food crops? Public provisioning of inputs. There's a whole ecosystem of investment when you're coming to agriculture, right? Hmm. Water. Let's take water for instance. Ravindra, one of the problems when you say the dryland farmer, I think part of this is for 70 years, Ravindra, this country has planned for the irrigated farmer and created the illusion that every acre in this country can be irrigated, which you know very well it cannot. The water in the world doesn't exist to irrigate every acre that we want. We never planned for the dryland farmer. We never thought about agriculture in terms of, if we meet the issues of the dryland farmer, if we plan and think for the dryland farmer, then we have something going in agriculture. Instead of which, we created these behemoths in irrigation and have led every farmer, or almost every farmer, to aspire to that kind of irrigation, which is not going to happen. Now, that's number one. Number two, both Gagan and Ravindra and the rest of you, please notice, we are discussing the pandemic, and mercifully in this discussion, we haven't had discussions and lectures on how many times you should wash your hands in a day. By the 15th of May, and you know it better than I do given the network you work with, by the 15th of May, Ravindra, will it be 100 or 150 districts in this country that will enter their annual water scarcity cycle? Yeah, where even today, people can't wash their hands twice a day in the guidelines that we give. They can't wash their hands twice a day today. What the heck is going to happen by May 15th when over 100 districts in the country, it's already happening across Telangana, isn't it? The shortages, we can see it in Osmanabad, Bid, and much of Marathwada and Maharashtra. But it's happening in Telangana. It's going to happen in a number of other areas. I have said for a very long time that water has to be we have to make a declaration like a tiny country called Uruguay did in a referendum, and it's been working okay for them, and it changed governments in that country. Water can never be privately owned, number one. Number two, all discussions of water have to take place, as do all discussions of agriculture, co-joined with our understanding and approach to climate change. If we are, and that word hardly exists in discourse in this country. Okay, it's just appalling how low the consciousness on that is. The second thing of water is that it's got to be linked to that discourse. Third, as I said, no private ownership of water, but we have to declare a priority of usage of water. Okay, yeah, I think your elementary school in Anantapur or in Amreli or wherever is deserving of a higher priority than my golf club, because a 19-hole golf course can use 18 million liters of water a day in the season to keep that turf just right, along with tons and tons and tons of pesticide each season that seeps into the water and contaminates the neighboring farmers' fields. I think you have to have that priority of water. Third, you have to end racketeering in water. Look, every year we see those photographs of those poor women standing with buckets and vessels near the water tanker in Aurangabad, in Marathwada. Do we ever ask ourselves, what does that poor woman pay for water, and what do we pay for water, and what do corporations pay for water? That woman pays at the start of this season. Right now, she'll be paying in May by the end of May first week, she'll be paying 45 paisa per liter of water. Okay, unless she is buying in very large quantities, which she cannot afford to do. Then the price would come down. Second, by the peak of the scarcity season, she'll be paying up to 1 rupee a liter of water. Third, in the same Marathwada, where the poorest women will be paying 1 rupee per liter, are 24 beer and alcohol factories, which get 3 to 5 million liters daily, MLD, 3 to 5 million liters daily for 4 paisa a liter. For 30 years, they got it at 1 paisa a liter. Then some brave and honorable NGO took them to the Supreme Court and won a huge victory. They're paying 4 times as much now, 4 paisa a liter. Where are your priorities as a society? I'm saying course correction nahi. 4 paisa ko 10 paisa banna. No, you have to have the priority for the water. You have to have that woman is a far greater priority than Kingfisher, right? So we have to establish a line of priorities because, we keep talking about the coming water crisis. I'm telling you that it's been there 40 years. 30 years it has been acute. 20 years it has been disastrous. And it's really going to get us, along with the climate change factors that are going to follow the scarcity with huge floods. And because of which are also man-made. That climate construction is man-made. So there are lots of things. Water has to be declared a basic right. I am not using the word basic human right because it's a basic right of all the species that share this planet with us and to who also we have to be responsible to. So yes, water is one. Seed. Get corporations out of seeds. You are allowing 3-4 companies to hold the world to ransom by its belly. And do not, and please, I beg you, do not go with these wacko, extreme opposite notions. It drives me crazy seeing them originate from a messiah in Vidarbha, which is the epicenter of farmer suicides in this country and perhaps in the world. So you really need to get farming out, corporations out of farming. Do we want farming to be controlled by communities or by corporations? Yeah. Do we want to understand that farming as irrigated, industrialized farming, or do we want to understand it as community farming? Ravindra, your question of dryland comes in there also. Yeah, the kind of irrigation that we are having is trying to push, people are trying to push you towards large-scale factory farming. That, by the way, is a source of incredible disease. You have a recent book. Unfortunately, you're not going to get it off Amazon for months. It's called Big Farms, Big Flu. Look it up. Which shows you how much disease has broken out on these gigantic farms with cattle, 10,000 cows and everything else, and gigantic numbers of pigs or beef. These and many of these concentrated farms have created disease. You have had viruses from there as well. I'm not saying this one came from there. I'm saying it is a recipe for disaster. Whereas the small farm, the farm owned by a small group of people, or many farms forming little collectives, gives the farmer and the farming family far greater control. Productivity will go up incredibly more at a much lower cost to the ecosystem, a much lower cost to the environment. Okay, productivity is higher on the small farms. The United Nations FAO, SOFI, the state of food insecurity in the world, even in 2014, they said, our present food systems are failing to feed people, which is a ridiculous anomaly, when there is enough food capacity in the world to feed a population of 14 billion not even the 8 or 9 billion that we are talking about. Okay? So redistribution is going to be another major element of that. Land distribution, concentration of land, these things, the concentration of land has to be broken up, which is increasingly, by the way, not in individual jamindars, but in corporations. That's also going to have to be broken up. Again and again, I will emphasize it's a course transformation, not a course correction. You're not going to tinker with one policy here and there, but you are going to have to expand immediately, gigantically expand the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. We've got 120 million people out of work. Where are you going to absorb them? Who's going to pay them a wage? Wages are going to collapse as this reserve army grows. So you've got to have, you're right, Gagan. I mean, it's got to mean that if the left next budget has got to have any sense at all, one of the things you've got to do is to declare a gigantic, that we are going to build starting today, a gigantic national health system, and in which public health is for public, as against, you know, how many thousands of Indian doctors are engaged in keeping the British and Canadians and Americans hale and hearty, right? How many Indian nurses are performing life-saving duties overseas, right? And here we are with a medical system increasingly privatized, medical colleges increasingly in the private sector. We need an entirely different system and say minimum 10% of the budget will be on this, and at the for a minimum of 10 years, and then we look at it again. We build a national health system. We have to have the same approach for education, for instance. These are things we need to do. Agriculture. Agriculture, it's about what in many other sectors, freedom from corporate power. You have to break that and beat it. Otherwise, do you know one last thing, Gagan? 2008, when Wall Street collapsed, when Wall Street collapsed, a handful of companies made super profits. The rest of Wall Street collapsed. All companies collapsed. I mean, all kinds of companies collapsed. One group of companies made it to the top of Fortune 500. You know, Fortune 500 also has a list. Fortune 100's fastest growing companies. You know, 4 out of the top 10 were agribusiness and food companies. Archer Daniels, McDonald, these were the guys who made the money. As the collapse under the pandemic takes place, pharma companies, big pharma companies, health business companies are making the killing that the food companies did then. Think that through. All these 3 questions that we've gone over are very closely linked. I've told you that there are a number of things you can do, but it can't be tinkering. It has to be transformation.
Okay. Really, thank you, Sainath. I mean, what you are saying is from the point of, if I look at it from the lens of RRAN, we need to be able to put these public arguments very, very seriously. And I think the message I take, don't tinker, look for transformation. I think we are also talking on behalf of 2 very important segments. One is Adivasi, which form the very big part. And I think they and their governance has to be respected and invested in. I would say somewhere there also. And of course, we've not talked of women, but I think how does this whole thing going to, is it going to kill them more, or is it going to be sort of, they could be looked at policies where they could be integrated, their empowerment could be integrated. I think these are some of the things we will have to think. But amazing, as always, Sainath, the span that you took us through, from the health, education, agriculture, look at the systemic issues. You went right up to the actually the real time problem with people, farmers are suffering, and how do we, within all that, locate pathways of different groups. We really would like that as Pari, I know, and you know, one of the most beautiful websites that you have, but I think we would like that some of our rain-fed and what is doing the rain-fed, the stories that are coming out from there, we could somewhere link it up with Pari. That would be really helpful to put up that part. I'm sure you're doing it, but from our huge constituency of about 600 members, we could put stories and we could give us some guidelines of how to do it. That would help.
Gagan, just let me interrupt you for a moment. One is that, see, I was going to say this and we got so involved in the discussion. If if all your 600 odd members made a practice of visiting the website twice a week, you will find the only website in the country that is reporting COVID-19 from the field, from every region of the country, rain-fed and otherwise, and which is reporting it through the voices of people who are trapped at that level, migrant laborers, boatmen, fishermen, farmers. So please, please look at ruralindiaonline.org. Second is, we'd welcome we'd welcome working with people, but our policy in getting in touch with us, bear in mind, we have a very simple policy. We do not cover organizations or groups. We talk through the lives of ordinary people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. And in that sense, we have covered a number of RRAN efforts, from Telangana and elsewhere.
Right. Thank you, Sainath. We will be putting your the whole thing. They have recorded it. There've been hundreds of questions which have come up. It's just that we can't take all. We tried to put a few together, but as always, really, thanks, Sainath. I really look up to you always for advice, and continue to collaborate with you and the amazing work you're doing. Thank you very much, and thank you, my viewers, for RRA on behalf for joining in. And we'll take forward this whole idea of what is the new role of RRA
And
in
please download those questions on the chat and send them to me.
Sure, we'll do that. Thank you and all the best and be safe, all of you. Thank you.